They found the trail in the snow at dawn. Drag marks, blood frozen solid, and something no one could explain. A dying horse had crawled over 100 yards through the coldest night in Colorado history, pulling something behind him. What they discovered at the end of that trail still haunts every rescuer who saw it. Marcus Webb stood at the cabin window, watching the sky darken into a shade of gray he hadn't seen in 52 years of Colorado winters. Behind him, the radio crackled with another emergency alert. Evacuate immediately. Historic cold front inbound, temperatures expected to reach minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Life-threatening conditions. He snorted, shutting the radio off mid-sentence. Weathermen always panicked too early. He'd survived blizzards that could have snapped weaker men in half. This would be just another one to outlast. Outside Dakota, the 19-year-old Appaloosa gelding who'd carried him through more miles than Marcus could count, paced the corral with unease. His breath burst into white plumes in the already cutting cold. He circled, stopped to stare straight into the cabin window, then resumed his tense loop. There was something almost desperate in the horse's eyes, something like a warning. Marcus ignored it. Animals always got jittery before a storm. Nothing new. He'd rescued Dakota from a slaughterhouse 7 years ago, paying $200 he couldn't afford to save a horse nobody wanted. The Appaloosa had been old even then, covered in scars from years of rough handling. But when their eyes met that day, Marcus saw something he recognized. The same exhaustion he felt after losing his daughter Sarah in a riding accident. The same defeat that made you stop fighting. They'd saved each other in ways neither could articulate. Marcus hauled another log onto the fire and checked his supplies. Plenty of food. Generator fully fueled. Dakota's barn was insulated and equipped with emergency heating. They'd be fine. The evacuation order was for city folks who panicked at the first snowflake. By midnight, he realized how catastrophically wrong he'd been. The temperature didn't drop gradually. It plummeted like a stone into dark water. The wind didn't howl. It screamed. Snow came sideways with such force it sounded like sand blasting the cabin walls. Marcus watched his thermometer fall past minus 20, minus 30, minus 40. When it hit minus 45, the generator sputtered and died. The backup heating system kicked in, but barely made a dent. Within minutes, frost began forming on the inside of the windows. Marcus's breath hung visible in the air. He pulled on every layer he owned and grabbed his emergency pack. He had to get to Dakota. The barn's structure had been questionable before this monster storm. If it collapsed with the horse inside, Dakota wouldn't stand a chance. Marcus shoved the door open and stepped into something that barely resembled earth. The cold didn't just bite Yi. It assaulted him, slammed into his lungs, and shattered each breath into glass. The world was a white void. He knew the barn sat just 40 yards away, yet he couldn't even see his own hands in front of him. He took 3 steps. Then the ground simply disappeared beneath him. The ravine swallowed Marcus whole. 1 second he was staggering through a world of white fury. The next he was falling into a pit of darkness, his body ricocheting off ice-packed earth and jagged rock. He hit the bottom with a force that ripped the breath from him in a ragged, choking gasp. Pain detonated in his left leg, sharp, electric, absolute, not a bruise, not a sprain, a break, a bad one. When he tried to shift, his ribs answered with a scream so fierce it felt like someone had driven hot iron into his chest. Every shallow breath scraped like razor blades inside him. Marcus lay motionless, staring at the narrow ribbon of gray sky high above. The ravine walls climbed 12 feet on both sides, straight and merciless. Even with 2 strong legs, getting out would have been near impossible. With a shattered limb and ribs that felt half-crushed, it wasn't just impossible, it was a death sentence. He fumbled for his radio with numb fingers. Gone. Probably lying somewhere in the snow above. His phone was in the cabin, charging on the kitchen counter, because he'd been so confident he'd only be outside for minutes. The emergency flare in his pack might work, but who would see it in this whiteout? The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away, and they'd likely evacuated days ago like sensible people. The cold worked fast at minus 48 degrees. Marcus could already feel it creeping through his layers, finding every gap in his clothing. His face felt like it was being pressed against a hot iron, that strange sensation where extreme cold mimics burning. His fingers were losing sensation despite the thick gloves. He tried to drag himself toward the ravine wall, but his leg buckled and he collapsed with a cry that was instantly swallowed by the wind. Blood soaked through his thermal pants, freezing almost immediately into a dark stain. The fracture was bad, possibly compound. Moving was impossible. Dakota would be safe in the barn, though. That thought brought Marcus a strange comfort as hypothermia began its insidious work. The horse had food, water, and heating. When the storm passed, someone would eventually check on the property. They'd find Dakota alive and well. That mattered more than Marcus wanted to admit. His mind started drifting, thoughts becoming loose and disconnected. He saw Sarah on her 10th birthday, laughing as she rode her pony in circles. He saw his late wife Maria, shaking her head at another one of his stubborn decisions. He saw Dakota on that slaughterhouse day, those intelligent eyes watching him with something that looked like understanding. Maybe this was how it was meant to end. Quick, quiet, frozen into the mountains that had shaped him, held him, punished him. A cleaner death than rotting in some hospital bed, cleaner than the slow, silent loneliness he'd been dying from for years anyway. Marcus let his eyes drift shut, feeling the cold crawl over him like a blanket. He waited for the darkness to finally claim him. He didn't hear the barn door splinter open half a mile away. He didn't hear the frantic, broken whinny of a horse who somehow knew down to its bones that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Dakota had survived 19 brutal winters, but every instinct in his old bones screamed that this night was different. Wrong. Dangerous. The barn trembled under each violent gust, the timber groaning like it might splinter apart at any second. The emergency heater hummed weakly in the corner, pushing out a thin, failing warmth that barely touched the frozen air pressing in from all sides. The Appaloosa couldn't settle. He paced his stall in tight, restless circles, ears flattened, breath bursting in sharp plumes, nostrils flaring, as if trying to catch a scent he desperately needed. Marcus had been gone too long. Too long. The man always checked on him during storms, always tossed extra hay into the trough, always spoke in that low, even voice that steadied the world. But tonight the door stayed shut. The footsteps never came. The silence was wrong enough to make the horse's heart hammer against his ribs. Something had happened. Something terrible. Dakota's pacing grew frantic. He kicked at the stall door once, twice, then with increasing violence. The wood splintered but held. His whinny cut through the storm's roar, desperate and urgent. No answer came. Then the main barn door buckled, the ancient hinges already loosened by time and weather, finally surrendered to the relentless wind. The door crashed inward and the storm invaded like a living thing. Snow blasted through the opening, temperature plummeting instantly. The emergency heater sputtered and died under the onslaught. Dakota's stall door swung open in the chaos. The logical choice was obvious. Stay inside, find a corner away from the wind, survive the night. Every survival instinct the horse possessed demanded he remain in whatever shelter the compromised barn still offered. Instead, Dakota walked toward the gaping doorway. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Ice crystals formed immediately on his coat, his mane whipping wildly in the hurricane-force wind. His first breath of the outside air felt like inhaling knives. The snow was deep enough to reach his chest in places, each step requiring enormous effort. But Dakota pushed forward into the lethal darkness, following something he couldn't name. Not a scent, The wind destroyed any trail within seconds. Not a sound. The storm drowned everything. It was deeper than instinct, more primal than training. It was the same incomprehensible force that had made Marcus spend his last $200 on a doomed slaughterhouse horse 7 years ago. Dakota pushed through snowdrifts that tried to swallow him whole, each one higher and heavier than the last. The cold was already burrowing into his muscles, stiffening them, slowing them, turning every step into a battle. His legs burned. Ice gathered around his hooves in thick rings, dragging at him, adding weight he could barely lift. The world had dissolved into white chaos and screaming wind. But then he found them. Tracks. Barely there, nearly swallowed by fresh snow, but still recognizable. Marcus's boot prints, staggered and desperate, leading away from the cabin. Dakota lowered his head and followed, driven by something deeper than instinct. An unbreakable tether between man and horse pulling him forward, even as the storm tried to erase the path. The trail suddenly ended at the edge of a ravine. Dakota approached cautiously, breath trembling in the frozen air. When he looked down, he saw the still, broken shape of his human, lying motionless at the bottom. The sound that tore from the Appaloosa's chest wasn't a simple whinny. It was raw, agonized, a cry ripped from the deepest place inside a creature who knew he had just found the worst moment of his life. Marcus's consciousness wavered, dimming and flaring like a candle about to gutter out. The world around him began dissolving, present bleeding into past until he no longer knew what was real and what was the desperate invention of a brain freezing from the inside out. Then he was back there, the slaughterhouse parking lot, 7 years earlier. July heat pressed down like a hand on his neck. The air stank of fear, blood, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. He hadn't meant to stop. His truck had simply run low on gas, and the station beside the slaughterhouse was the closest option. He'd planned to fuel up, get back on the road, mind his own business. But then he saw them. A line of horses penned behind the chain-link fence, their bodies trembling, their ears laid flat, each one already halfway surrendered to whatever fate waited inside that building. And among them, one pair of eyes found his, wide, terrified, intelligent. Dakota. In that moment, Marcus wasn't a customer at a gas pump. He was a man staring into the soul of an animal begging not to be forgotten. Dakota had been covered in whip marks and cigarette burns, ribs visible through matted coat. But those eyes held something Marcus recognized from his own mirror: absolute defeat, the kind that comes when you've decided dying is easier than continuing. Marcus had lost Sarah 3 months before. His marriage was crumbling. The ranch was failing. He had no business taking on a broken horse when he couldn't even fix himself. But he pulled out his wallet anyway, counted the bills twice, and made an offer the slaughterhouse owner accepted with a shrug. He'd walked Dakota out of that place expecting nothing. Maybe the horse would live a few more years. Maybe putting something back into the world would ease the guilt of letting his daughter ride that day, of not checking the tack himself, of being too distracted with paperwork to notice the saddle girth was frayed. But Dakota had recovered. Slowly, painfully, but completely. The horse learned to trust again, learned that hands could be gentle, that humans weren't all monsters. And somewhere in the process of healing Dakota, Marcus found he was healing too. Not completely. Some wounds never close, but enough to keep breathing, keep moving forward. The memory dissolved and Marcus was back in the frozen ravine, each breath coming slower than the last. His core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. The shivering that had racked his body for the first hour had stopped, and he knew that was bad. His brain was shutting down non-essential functions to protect vital organs. Soon even that wouldn't be enough. He thought he heard something above. Probably hallucination. The mind played tricks when death got close, but then he heard it again, closer. the sound of something large moving through snow. Marcus forced his eyes open, though the lids felt frozen shut. Through the swirling white above, a shape appeared at the ravine's edge, dark against the pale sky. Four-legged. Impossible. Dakota stared down at him, ice already crusting the horse's face and mane. Their eyes met across 12 feet of empty air, and Marcus felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Go back, please, boy. Go back." But Dakota was already searching for a way down, whinnying urgently, refusing to abandon the man who'd once refused to abandon him. Dakota found a sloped edge on the far side of the ravine, a narrow, uneven path carved by years of erosion. It wasn't a trail meant for hooves, but it was the only way down. He began the descent, every step a gamble. His hooves slipped on ice hidden beneath the powder. His legs skidded out, splaying dangerously. Twice he came within a heartbeat of crashing to the bottom, saving himself only by sheer instinct and desperate strength. Each correction sent a bolt of pain through muscles already stiffening under the brutal cold. By the time Dakota reached the ravine floor, his breath tore out of him in ragged bursts, white clouds freezing in the air as fast as they formed. His coat had become a shell of ice. The sweat from his earlier sprint had frozen solid, turning him into a trembling statue wrapped in frost. His legs shook violently, not just from exhaustion, but from the cold burrowing deep into bone. Still, he pushed forward. Dakota lowered his head and exhaled warm air over Marcus's face in soft, urgent puffs. Marcus's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that looked cloudy, unfocused, half in this world, half already slipping into the next. His lips were blue. His skin was a ghostly pale, stretched tight over features gone slack with cold. Dakota recognized it. The fading, the letting go. And he refused to accept it. The horse tried to help him stand, pushing his muzzle under Marcus's arm, attempting to lift. But Marcus screamed, a raw sound of agony that cut through even the wind's fury. His shattered leg couldn't support any weight. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his broken body. Dakota tried again from a different angle, more gently this time. Marcus grabbed onto the horse's mane with fingers that barely functioned, managing to pull himself a few inches before collapsing back into the snow with a cry of defeat. "Can't," Marcus gasped. "Too broken. You have to leave me." But Dakota refused to accept this. The horse circled Marcus, whinnying urgently, searching for a solution his animal mind couldn't quite grasp. He grabbed Marcus's coat collar in his teeth and pulled. Marcus slid maybe 6 inches through the snow before Dakota's grip failed, and he stumbled backward. The Appaloosa's legs were beginning to fail. The cold at this temperature didn't gradually numb. It invaded like poison, turning muscle rigid, making joints lock. Dakota could feel his body starting to shut down the same way Marcus's was. If they stayed in this ravine much longer, they'd both die here. Dakota made another attempt to pull Marcus, this time getting a better grip on the thick canvas coat. He dragged the man perhaps a foot before his front legs buckled and he crashed down beside Marcus in the snow. The horse lay there, sides heaving, ice forming in his nostrils with each breath. His strength was gone. His body was giving up. But when he looked at Marcus, something in those fading human eyes made Dakota push himself back up onto trembling legs. Dakota understood the truth with a clarity only instinct could give. If he couldn't lift Marcus out on his feet, then he needed another way. Any way. The horse slowly folded his legs beneath him, lowering himself with careful, painful movements until his body pressed firmly against Marcus's frozen side. He shared what little warmth he still had, a trembling furnace wrapped in ice. Then, with a resolve that went beyond instinct, beyond reason, Dakota did what no creature should have been able to do in that cold. He began to crawl. Muscles screamed. Frost cracked across his coat. Every inch forward was a battle against pain and physics. But Dakota dug his hooves and knees into the snow, dragging both himself and his human toward the slope, inch by impossible inch. It wasn't survival anymore. It was loyalty made physical. It was love made movement. Dakota crawled through hell on earth, dragging Marcus inch by agonizing inch. The horse used his hind legs to push forward, his teeth gripped firmly on Marcus's coat collar, pulling with every ounce of strength left in his failing body. Each movement was torture. The frozen ground tore at Dakota's chest and belly. Ice cut into his legs like glass shards. Marcus drifted between consciousness and oblivion, unable to process what was happening. In his more lucid moments, he realized the impossibility of what Dakota was attempting. Horses don't crawl. Their bodies aren't built for it. Their instincts don't allow for this kind of self-destruction. Yet here was Dakota, doing the impossible because the alternative was leaving Marcus to freeze. The ravine's slope proved nearly insurmountable. Dakota would gain 3 feet, then slide back 2. His hooves couldn't find purchase on the icy incline. He'd brace with his hind legs, pull Marcus upward, then have to rest while his muscles screamed and his lungs burned from the frozen air. Blood spotted the snow behind them. Dakota's chest was raw and bleeding from the constant friction. His front legs, forced into unnatural positions, had begun to swell. The cold was working deeper into his core now, slowing his heart, making his movements increasingly sluggish. But every time Dakota stopped, Marcus would murmur something. Sometimes it was, "Leave me," sometimes it was, "I'm sorry," and once it was, "Sarah would have loved you." Those words, barely audible, kept the horse moving when his body demanded he quit. They reached the top of the ravine after what felt like hours. Dakota collapsed at the edge, his body shutting down from the effort and exposure. Marcus lay beside him, both of them broken and dying in the snow. The cabin lights were visible now, maybe 30 yards away through the storm. It might as well have been 30 miles. Dakota's breathing had become shallow and erratic. His eyes were starting to glaze. Frostbite had turned his muzzle white, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes. This was the end. He'd gotten Marcus out of the ravine, but it wasn't enough. They'd both die here, just within sight of safety. Marcus managed to turn his head, looking into Dakota's eyes. He saw the horse fading, saw the price of this loyalty written in every labored breath. Something broke inside him then, something that had been frozen since Sarah's death. He couldn't let Dakota die for him, not like this, not after everything. "One more try," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "Together." He tied part of his belt around Dakota's halter with numb fingers that barely obeyed. Then, using his good leg and whatever remained of his strength, Marcus pushed. Dakota, sensing the effort, forced his exhausted body forward. They moved 6 inches. Then another 6, then another. The cabin stayed impossibly far away. They moved through the night like broken machines, each forward motion smaller than the last. Marcus would push with his functioning leg. Dakota would drag, using what remained of his strength, and together, they'd gain another few inches of frozen ground. Sometimes they'd collapse for minutes at a time, gathering whatever energy their dying bodies could manufacture. Dakota's front legs had given out completely an hour ago. The joints had frozen, tendons damaged beyond use. Now he pulled with only his neck and hindquarters, a grotesque parody of movement that should have been impossible. The skin on his chest had split open in multiple places, blood freezing almost instantly into dark streaks across his spotted coat. Marcus kept trying to untie the belt, to free Dakota from the suicide mission, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate anymore. Frostbite had claimed most of his extremities. He couldn't feel his hands or feet, couldn't tell if he was even gripping the belt or just imagining it. His mind wandered through memories, mixing past and present into a confused jumble. He saw himself teaching Sarah to ride, her tiny hands gripping the reins while he walked beside her. He saw Maria on their wedding day, laughing at some joke he'd forgotten. He saw Dakota in the slaughterhouse pen, those eyes that had recognized a kindred broken spirit. All the moments that mattered, compressed into this single frozen stretch of Colorado ground. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if the words came out loud or just echoed in his skull. "I'm so sorry, boy. You deserved better than this." Dakota's response was to pull harder, a desperate lunge that moved them perhaps 8 inches before his hind legs collapsed and he lay flat in the snow. The horse's breathing had become a wet rattle. Hypothermia and exhaustion were destroying him from the inside. His body temperature had dropped to lethal levels. Organs were beginning to fail. Marcus screamed into the wind, a primal sound of grief and rage and helplessness. He'd spent 7 years saving Dakota from death, and now he was killing him. The horse was dying because Marcus had been too stubborn to evacuate, too broken to care about his own survival, too lost in grief to see that something still needed him. "Please," Marcus begged, to God or fate, or whatever force governed this frozen hell. "Take me, let him live, please." The wind answered with indifferent fury. The temperature held steady at -48 degrees. The cabin remained 20 yards away, close enough to see the outline of the porch, too far to reach before they both froze solid. Dakota tried one more time to move, managed to shift his weight forward maybe 3 inches, then stopped. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed to almost nothing. Marcus felt the horse's body go still beneath him. The Appaloosa had nothing left to give. Neither did Marcus. They lay together in the snow, waiting for the cold to finish what it had started. Dawn broke over the San Juan Mountains with no mercy. The sky turned from black to gray, revealing a landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees overnight. -48 had become -50. The kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes, that turned breath into ice before it left your lungs. Marcus's eyes cracked open, surprised to find he was still alive. Barely. His core temperature had dropped so low that his heart beat perhaps once every 3 seconds. His brain had shut down. Everything non-essential. He couldn't feel his body anymore, couldn't tell where he ended and the frozen ground began. Dakota lay motionless beside him, covered in a layer of frost that made him look like a statue carved from ice. Marcus couldn't tell if the horse was breathing, couldn't see any movement in that once powerful chest. He tried to speak Dakota's name, but his jaw wouldn't move, muscles frozen into rigidity. This was it then. The end. They'd made it through the night only to die with sunrise. At least they were together. At least Dakota hadn't died alone in that ravine. Marcus found a strange peace in that thought, his mind starting to drift toward whatever came next. Then he heard it. Faint at first, almost lost in the wind. A rhythmic thumping that didn't belong to the storm. Marcus's brain, sluggish and confused, tried to place the sound. It grew louder, more distinct, the unmistakable whop, whop, whop of helicopter rotors cutting through frozen air. His heart, barely beating, suddenly surged. The rescue team, the same one he'd stubbornly refused 3 days ago when they'd offered evacuation, they'd come back. But why? The storm was still raging. Flying in these conditions was almost suicidal. The helicopter appeared through the white chaos, a massive orange and white bird fighting against wind that wanted to slam it into the mountainside. It circled once, spotlight sweeping across the snow, then locked onto the 2 shapes near the cabin. Marcus tried to wave, but his arm wouldn't respond. Tried to shout, but no sound came. He could only lie there and watch as the helicopter fought to find a landing spot in the blizzard. It touched down 50 yards away, rotors still spinning, and 3 figures in Arctic gear jumped out and ran toward them. "We've got 2 down," the lead rescuer shouted into his radio. "Male, approximately 50, severe hypothermia and injuries, and a horse, Jesus Christ, a horse, both critical." They swarmed around Marcus first, checking vitals, calling out numbers that meant nothing to him. Then 2 of them moved to Dakota, and Marcus saw the shock on their faces as they examined the horse's torn chest, his frozen legs, the trail of blood and disturbed snow leading back toward the ravine. "How far did this animal drag him?" one rescuer asked, her voice cracking with disbelief. "From the tracks? At least 100 yards? Maybe more?" The lead rescuer shook his head. "I've been doing this 20 years. I've never seen anything like this." The rescue happened in fragments. Marcus remembered heated blankets being wrapped around him, the burning sensation as his frozen tissue began to thaw, someone saying his core temperature was 79 degrees, far into the danger zone. He remembered being lifted onto a stretcher, the helicopter's interior a blast of warmth that felt like fire against his skin. But mostly he remembered fighting to stay conscious long enough to see them load Dakota. The horse was still alive. Somehow, though the veterinary specialist who'd come with the rescue team kept shaking her head as she worked. They'd brought equipment for Marcus, but had to improvise everything for a 1,000-pound animal who shouldn't have survived an hour in those conditions, let alone the entire night. "His body temperature is critical," the vet shouted over the rotors. "Severe frostbite on all 4 legs, multiple lacerations, possible organ damage. I don't know how he's still breathing." "Will he make it?" Marcus managed to croak, his first words since the rescue began. The vet met his eyes, and Marcus saw the answer before she spoke. "I've never treated anything like this. The damage is extensive. Even if we stabilize him, the frostbite alone could be fatal. His front legs are the worst. The tissue is already necrotic." They loaded Dakota into a separate emergency transport helicopter that had arrived minutes after the first. Marcus watched through the window as they worked on the horse, hooking up IV lines, wrapping his legs, trying to reverse damage that seemed irreversible. Dakota's eyes were closed, his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. The flight to Grand Junction took 40 minutes but felt like seconds. Marcus kept slipping in and out of consciousness, waking each time with the same question on his lips. "Dakota?" "Still alive," someone would answer, and Marcus would drift away again. He woke in the ICU 3 weeks later with no memory of the time between. A nurse explained he'd been in a medically induced coma while his body recovered from severe hypothermia, frostbite, broken ribs, and a shattered femur. They'd saved most of his fingers and toes, but he'd lost 2 on his left foot. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive, that without the horse's body heat during that final hour, he would have frozen solid. Marcus didn't feel lucky. He felt empty. When he finally found his voice, the question came out broken and raw. "The horse, Dakota, where is he?" The nurse's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in that way medical professionals learn when delivering difficult news. "He's at the veterinary hospital. Mr. Webb, you should know that his condition was very serious. The veterinarians have been working around the clock, but the damage was severe. The frostbite, the exposure, the injuries from dragging you." "Is he alive?" Marcus interrupted, his heart monitor accelerating. The nurse hesitated just long enough to make Marcus's chest tighten. "Yes, but there's something you need to understand about his condition." 2 days later, they wheeled Marcus into the veterinary hospital's specialized recovery ward. His hands shook as they approached Dakota's stall, not from the cold this time, but from fear of what he'd find. Dakota stood in the corner, and Marcus's breath caught. The magnificent Appaloosa who'd crawled through a frozen nightmare looked like a shadow of himself. He'd lost at least 200 pounds, ribs visible beneath a bonnet, coat still patchy from frostbite damage, but it was his legs that made Marcus's eyes burn with tears. Heavy bandages covered all 4 limbs, specialized boots protecting what remained of his hooves. The front legs were the worst, wrapped from hoof to knee in layers of medical dressing. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead veterinarian, stood beside the wheelchair. "The frostbite destroyed significant tissue in his front hooves. We had to amputate portions of the hoof wall and some of the underlying structures. He'll never run again, Mr. Webb. With prosthetics and proper care, he can walk comfortably and live a full life. But the damage was too severe for him to be the horse he was before." Marcus wheeled himself closer to the stall door. Dakota's head lifted, ears swiveling forward. For a moment, neither moved. Then the horse took 3 careful, painful steps toward him, and their foreheads met through the bars. Marcus broke. 7 years of grief, 3 weeks of uncertainty, and the crushing weight of what Dakota had sacrificed all came out in ragged sobs. "I'm so sorry. You should have left me. You should have saved yourself." Dakota exhaled softly against his face, that familiar warm breath Marcus thought he'd never feel again. "He fought us for 3 days, Dr. Chen said quietly. "We weren't sure he'd make it. His organs were shutting down, his body was giving up, but every time we thought we'd lost him, he'd rally, like he was waiting for something." She paused. "I think he was waiting for you." Marcus spent the next hour with his hand on Dakota's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath scarred skin. They'd both survived the impossible. They were both broken in ways that wouldn't fully heal, but they were alive. And somehow that was enough. 3 months later, Marcus moved Dakota to a specialized sanctuary where horses with disabilities lived out their days with dignity and care. He visited every single day, sometimes for hours, sometimes just to sit quietly beside his friend. They'd saved each other twice now. Once in a slaughterhouse parking lot, once in a frozen hell. The debt between them had long since been erased, replaced by something that didn't need a name. On warm days, Marcus would walk beside Dakota as the horse moved carefully through green pastures on his custom prosthetics, and he'd remember a night when loyalty defied death itself, when love proved stronger than the killing cold, when a horse chose to crawl through hell rather than let go. If this story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another incredible story of survival and loyalty that will leave you speechless. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.